Now, thank you very much for coming back. And now, as a closure of this very successful day, we have a rather unusual situation. I am chairing this session and will be ventriloquizing Francesca and Joe, who could not come here physically but did send a paper. And after Francesca's paper, Valentina Guarulli will present her paper, and then we'll, if everything works, have Alexander Sens per Skype. So let us start with Francesca and Joe's paper. The handout is circulating, and there should be a text and a couple of parallels on the other side of the handout. Francesca and Joe has published a plethora of papers on many topics, but mostly on epigram, and when it comes to epigram, she seems to be the eminent expert, among others, also on epigrams on sundials and Posidipus's epigrams, of course. So her paper today is on two epigrams from Pamphylia, and the title is A Sundial for a Deceased Woman. Two funerary epigrams from Silion in Pamphylia from the 1st and 2nd centuries AD are inscribed on the front, this is A on your handout, and on the lateral side, this is B in your handout, of a little altar with a horologion, this is A1, very probably a sundial, now lost. Francesca presents the text following the first editor, Wimmer, only with a different accent at B4, so she has Tumere instead of Tumere, and I will read the translation. So epigram A, Kidromias has erected both the grave and the clock for Zobalima's spirits as reward for her conjugal love. After you have gazed at the hours and at the tomb, O passerby, say, may I, Kidromias' wife, be again remembered? And B, I was set up in order to indicate how much course has accomplished Eos, and that here there is Zobalima's tomb. If you passerby are longing for knowing who made the monument, you will learn it very readily. Kidromias has erected me for his delightful wife. The epigrams are two of the very few Greek epigrams on sundials whose scanty number was recently increased by epigram 52 Austin Bastianini, attributed by the editors to Posidipus of Pella. The monument was dedicated by Kidromias to his wife Zobalima, as we see Gametis in A4 and Gamete in B4, or exactly to her daimones, see daimosi in line 2 of epigram A, as reward for her matrimonial love. We read in the second line of A, anti-philandreias. The term philandreie is used here in the positive sense as love for one's husband. Apart from this characteristic, the only epithet that marks the deceased woman is tumeres, joined with gamete, so tumere gamete in line 4 of epigram B. Unlike in most funerary epigrams, no other moral merit or domestic virtue of Zobalima is praised, nor are mentioned children or philotechnia, often associated to the love for one's husband. The rare adjective tumeres, delightful, well-pleasing, makes clear how joyful his wife has been for Kidromias' heart. This appreciation recalls the Homeric expression, take a look at handout number 1, alohon tumarea from Odyssey 23, 232, with reference to Penelope. It is not casual that the adjective replaces here, after Odysseus' homecoming, the very frequent and formulaic epithet of Penelope, periphron Penelopea. We find indeed the same expression in Iliad 9:336. Take a look at 2 and 3 in your handout, applied to divorced slave Briseis when Achilles regrets angrily with the imperative terpestho that the woman is now destined to delight Agamemnon. The choice of gamete as variant for alohos of the Homeric formula could suggest the reference to a Coridie alohos as the legitimate wedded wife, Zobalima, and so fit better to the passage of the Odyssey than to that of Iliad. So every other virtue is implicitly included. Penelope, whose love for the husband was in any case beyond dispute, recurs frequently and explicitly in the epigrams as a model for women. Here, the reference could be caught through the Homeric memory evoked from Thumere, foreshadowed in the previous mention of Zobalima's Philandreia in the first epigram A, line 2. The Homeric adjective thumeres recurs again at Odyssey 17:199 as epithet applied to a skeptron, in reference to a woman, again, in the formulaic expression allochon thumerea at Hesiod fragment 43. It is usually identified with thumeres that with different vocalism and different accent recurs in the neuter form thumeres as an adverb at Odyssey 10, this is handout 4, 362, as adjective bioton thumere at Homeric hymn to Demeter and a couple of other Homeric hymns. Callimachus supplies this adjective in the form thumeres to Daitas in his own hymn to Demeter, and uses the adverbial form thumeres in his hymn to Delos. Apollonius of Rhodes, in Book 1, line 705, joins thumeres to epos, but Hermann Franklin conjectured thumedes at 1714. Only Moschus, this is handout 5, number 22829, in Hetairas thumereas refers again the adjective to women. The position of Kudriamus' name at the beginning of the first epigram and at the end of the second as a rector of the Horologion suggests that he intended to honor his wife as well as to enjoy a good reputation for this useful instrument, as it is confirmed by the device of the speaking monument in the second epigram, with the emphasis on sundial's function and the mythological allusion to Eos. In handout 6, you will see from Theocritus, Kupoton, Meseton, Dromon, Anien, Harmas, Selanas. This could confirm in our text the mythological allusion to the run that Eos takes alone with her horses Lampas and Phaeton. As a further confirmation, we could compare an anonymous epigram on a sundial datable after 638 AD. This is Antologia Palatina 9807, handout number 7, where we have Antigas Erigeneus, the vault of Eos, with the Homeric epithet applied to dawn. In the opinion of Merkelbach-Stauber, by contrast, Eos is not the goddess of dawn, but simply the common noun. For the expression dromon anue, compare Euripides Phoenicia 163:4 in a lyrical context, eithe dromon nephelas posin exanusaimi di aetheros. Analogous to posandromon eniken eos in our epigram B, line 1, are in the epigram Antologia Palatina 1461 by Metrodorus and hexametric Gryphos, the expression poson parallelitien eus in reference to a sundial, as well as possos chronos passes chimeras per eke, inscribed on a sundial from Histria, late 4th and or early 3rd century BC, if the lacunae are correctly filled. At Antologia Palatina 97021 by Paulus Silentiarius, in reference to a water clock, we find for the sun dromon phaetontidos aigles. The definition of the sundial as heliakon horon angelon hemeriois in an inscription consisting of an elegiac couplet from Argolis in the 2nd century AD, this is equally interesting. It is worthy of note that in the layout of the second epigram, the last word, Kydriamus' name, seems to be inscribed separately in the middle of the stone in order to impress by this visual emphasis the viewer's gaze and not only the reader's memory. In any case, in the first epigram, the passerby is invited in the first place at A, line 3, to gaze at the hours indicated from the sundial, horas atresas, signs of the expectation that the Horologion could draw his attention and only then to give to the deceased woman his voice in order to express aloud her wish to be remembered, a topical motif in the funerary epigrams. The choice of the verb atreo can suggest the importance of an alert look, perhaps more than verbs such as blepo, derkomai, tiaomai, leuso, horao, and eisrao, which are frequently used, as well as atreo or eisatreo for the appeal to the passerby. The peculiarity of the identification passerby deceased in order to express the wish to be remembered against the common invitation to lament or say hello is pointed out by Wiemer. At line 4 of epigram A, in Francesca's opinion, Wiemer rightly prefers to expound menestcheseien as passive form, so ich, die Gattin des Kidromias, möchte, dass man sich meiner wiederum erinnert, on the basis that the passive form of mimnesco is, quote, seit der Septuaginta geläufig, unquote, and rejects the suggestion by Merkelbach, who suggested the translation, auch ich, die Gattin des Kydromias, möchte wiederum des Kydromias gedenken. Wiemer's interpretation is, die Verstorbene fordert also den Betrachter durch dessen Mund auf, sich ihrer zu erinnern, suits fitly this traditional motif of the funerary inscriptions. Moreover, Wiemer pointed out that in the opinion of Merkelbach, we should refer the genitive hydromiou as well to mnestieien apokoinou, despite its position between the article he and the substantive gametis. A further confirmation of the passive form could be aimnestos, had in everlasting remembrance, or the twofold meaning, active and passive, of other adjectives with vimnesco, a second element, e.g., amnestos, forgotten or forgetful, eumnestos, while remembering, mindful, of which is good to make remembrance or celebrated, polymnestos, much remembering, mindful, much remembered. In the second epigram, where the monument is speaking, a full line, B1, is dedicated to explain the function of the horologion. With regard to semaino, it is interesting to note the definition of horaon sophon semantora, skilled indicator of the hours, at Ontologia Palatina 97793, only probably a sundial. In addition, the use of semaino can represent a cross-reference to the basic sense, sign or sema A1, as a sort of identification of the two elements of the monument. The mention of the instrument's function goes before that of the taphos, in contrary arrangement with regard to the first epigram, sema kai horologion, where, in their turn, sema and horologion form a chiasmus with regard to horas atresas taphon. A further chiastic word order could be recognized between kydromiou gametis in line 4 of A and gamete kydromias in line 4 of B if we read both epigrams in sequence. The structure of the two epigrams is well balanced and parallel. The first two lines are descriptive, the last two consist of the invitation to the passerby. The sense is concluded in every line without enjambment. We can note a perfect correspondence of the name of the deceased woman, this is line 2 in A and line 2 in B, in the same place of the line and in the same case, Zobaliamas, as well as the correspondence of the invitation to the passerby twice in the second half of each epigram, so lines 3 and 4 of A and 3 and 4 of B. The epigrams are indeed independent, but their correlation is evident. The name of Kydromias at the beginning of the first epigram and at the end of the second includes them in a ring composition at distance, so to say. In any case, it appears 3 times, once more than Zubalima's name. With regard to the dialect, in addition to Philandreus in line 2 of A with Ionic dissonance and Thumere with Ionic vocalism, we find the epic and Ionic form eos in line 1 of B. By contrast, for the passerby, invoked with a twofold apostrophe in the third line of A, O xene, and in the third line of B, xene, xenos is preferred to the Ionic form xenos. In the same way as Attic rasta, this is line 3 of B, is preferred to the Ionic form reitata. If Philandreus is merely a spelling variant of Philandrius, by contrast, we find horologion instead of orologeion at A1. The epic form Tjake, without the syllabic augment at B4, by contrast, at A1 there is eteuxe, just after Thumere gamete, could be added as further Homeric element to the probable Homeric allusion of allochon Thumarea. The author sometimes varies the words. For the tomb, he uses sema in line 1 of A and taphos in line 3 of A and in line 2 of B. For the wife, gametis in line 4 of A and gamete in line 4 of B. For the erection of the funerary monument, teucho in line 1 of A and titiemi in lines 3 and 4 of B. To Horace in third line of A, whose sense of the division of day and night into hours begins in the Hellenistic period, such as, for instance, in Callimachus, fragment 555, corresponds the periphrasis poson dromon enuken eos in the first line of B with the expression dromon anuein attested in poetry, as we have said, together with verbs such as teucho in A1, lego A3, mimnesco A4, semaino B1, histemi B1, titiemi B3 and 4, mantano B3 twice. Well attested in poetry and usual as well in inscribed epigrams, we find the unusual philandreie, the rare thumeres, two verbs, athreo and potiao, specific and deep, in order to underline the importance assigned to the role that the passerby plays. Semainein in semainein hesteka, first line of B, final clause by infinitive, and the word order, taphos hos estin in line 2 of B, are worthy of note. The prosody is regular with two exceptions. The short syllable before initial zeta, zobalimas, at line 2 of A and line 2 of B, as already in Homer, before zakynthos and zelea, justified by the proper name, as well as explained by the later tendency of zeta to be perceived as a simple sound, and the analogous failure of the initial raw to lengthen the preceding short syllable at B3, as in Homer Odyssey 19577 or 2175, just like in the corresponding epic form reitat, where Arens corrected hosken reitat. There is a correptio epica at A1. No hexameter is holodactylic. The spondes are only in the first half of the line, with a succession of two spondes, once in the pentameter of line A4, once in the hexameter of line B1, and a succession of three spondes in the hexameter of line A3, perhaps in order to underline the importance of the hour's reading, emphasized as well by the main caesura after arthresis. In the pentameter at A4, the first hemistich, after a succession of 4 long syllables, ends in a monosyllable, which is not very common. The monosyllable, the article he, is a prepositive, but prepositives such as the article or kai are allowed before the pentameter caesura, provided that another precedes. As here it is not. Precedes au, a postpositive with an unpleasant hiatus. The second half of the pentameter is regular. In the hexameters of both epigrams, the main caesura is in the third foot, feminine at A1, B1, and 3, masculine at A3. In the second half, there is as well a bucolic diaresis at A3 after the masculine caesura and at B3 after the feminine caesura. In both epigrams, the author expresses the general wish to immortalize one's name, and in both the passerby is charged with the fulfillment of this hope. To him is attributed the longing for potiais, knowing the name of the constructor of the monument before, whose information could allow its diffusion in the form eide potiais matiein rasta matiese. in any case are highlighted the importance and the utility of the instrument on which depends both the memory of Zubalima and that of Kidromias, because the tomb and the sundial are joined together. No philosophical considerations on the brevity of life or the inexorability of the death are made, nor is there any kind of admonition or recommendation, as in other epigrams, especially concerning time. So, for instance, in IP 1043, an anonymous epigram that refers as well to a sundial, where there is an invitation to the passerby to live zeti in the fullest sense, nor any trace of mourning of the surviving husband, fully gratified by the joys of marriage. Apparently, the passerby was invited to look with serenity at the grave sundial of Silion, a town in the remote and quiet land of Paphilia, and the same peacefulness, without any sort of regret, reigned in Kidromias' and Zubalimas' matrimonial life. So this is what Francesca had in store for us. And now we turn to Valentina Garuli, who is a dear friend and a phenomenal scholar who has written several monographs and edited volumes. Her most recent is Biblos Lane, Epigraphia Letteratura Epitaphio from 2012, and she is now working on a big project about bilingual inscriptions. Valentina.
Thank you, Ivana, for your kind introduction. And first of all, let me join the other speakers in expressing my warmest thanks to the organizers of this wonderful conference for the kind invitation and their hospitality. It's a great pleasure to be here, not only because of the pleasant atmosphere, but also because the organizers are demonstrating that what seems impossible sometimes can become possible if people believe in what they do, and the organizers are doing so. So let me take you now to the partially unexplored land of Hapax legomena in inscribed funerary epigrams. As you all know, Hapax legomenon means something said only once and refers to a word occurring only once in a given corpus. In my investigation, I will be using the term hapax to refer to words that occur only once and only in funerary verse inscriptions. I have decided to start from a well-defined selection of texts, which is, in my opinion, a representative selection, so a good starting point. It's Peck's collection of Greek funerary verse inscriptions, which includes 138 inscribed epitaphs. But let me add a preliminary remark. I will use figures to give you a more precise picture of what we are talking about, of the situation of this selection of texts. I will give figures with only one decimal place, for the evidence is limited, of course, and does not guarantee an extreme specificity of, two places. So, in Peck's collection, I have found 131 hapax legomena. So inscribed epitaphs containing hapax make up 6.2% of this collection. In other words, more than 6 verse inscriptions out of 100 use words unattested in the literary tradition. 13% contain even more than one hapax in the same text. either 2 or 3 in the same text, and most of these come from Asia Minor or the Aegean Islands. Some geography. The majority of the funerary verse inscriptions containing hapax come from Asia Minor, 40.6%, and particularly from Ionia, more than 9%. After Asia Minor, the islands give the highest number of funerary verse inscriptions containing hapaxes, 26%, and Crete has 8%. The contribution of mainland Europe to funerary inscribed hapaxes, so to say, is significant, more than 19%, and Greece has more than 14% of such inscriptions, with many coming from central Greece, especially Athens. Italy, especially Rome, gives 6.5% of our small corpus. Africa is in last position, but Egypt alone has almost 10% of the whole corpus. Some chronology now. The range of time which appears to be the most productive of hapaxes in funerary inscriptions extends from the 2nd century BC to the 2nd, 3rd centuries AD. And the 2nd century AD, in particular, including the end of the previous century and the beginning of the following, gives something like 37.3% of the whole corpus. Let us keep in mind the 2nd century AD. What is most interesting is investigating the morphology and semantics of these apaxes. What kind of words are these? The main groups of these hapaxes are compounds, 61%, derivatives, 30%, and borrowings, only 3.5%. Compounds have the advantage of condensing in one word a complex concept, even an entire phrase, as Francesca Schironi wrote. And they can be classified as either indirect or direct compounds, depending whether they refer to an external referee or contain their own referee. The majority of compound hapaxes, 69.4%, are indirect compounds, 20% are direct compounds, and 10.5% are verbal compounds. Indirect compounds, well, not all of them sound properly idiomatic in Greek. Some indeed sound awkward, and others are at least ambiguous. A few examples. The adjective lithokalles is used agreeing with the noun morphe and refers to a statue erected on the tomb of Salvius, son of Aristides, from Halicarnassus, in an inscription dating from the 2nd, 3rd century AD. This adjective, which is not listed in this slide, lithokalles, is hard to translate. Of course, stone and beauty are certainly involved in its meaning, but one can wonder how exactly these meanings are related in the adjective. Lithokalles, does it mean beautifully made on stone or something? Other indirect compounds are at least ambiguous. Let us take lipadelphos. It's attested in an epitaph verse inscription from Smyrna, dating from the 2nd, 1st century BC, which is the epitaph of the brothers Icesios and Hermippos. This adjective, lipadelphos, qualifies the mother of the dead brothers, the mother who has been left alone and is qualified as lipadelphos. Comparison with the Greek compounds beginning with lip or lipo is necessary, and this comparison shows, on the one hand, a group of compounds such as lipometor, lipopator, lipes anor, with an active meaning of the theme lipo, lip, who has left. And on the other hand, some compounds such as lipopais, lipotechnos, where lipo has a privative meaning, without. Such meaning is frequent in the other compounds beginning with lipo, compounds which do not have a noun denoting a relative as the second element of the compound. For example, lipoergates without a job, lipozygos without a partner, and so on. So in our case, lipadelphos seems to be similar to this second group of compounds, but its meaning is at least ambiguous. A 1st century BC epitaph from Telmessos describes the deceased as aner musorrytos. The example is not in the slide. I'm adding it now. Musorrytos, the verb ryo, maybe either intransitive, who flows from the muses, or causative, who makes spring poetry. In any case, the adjective musorrytos conveys the common metaphor of words as a liquid flowing from the lips of the poet. These compounds are obviously intended to give a special magniloquence to verse inscriptions, and they qualify either the dead person or the monument in various ways. So they praise the virtues and the skills of the deceased, and they praise and describe the monument. For example, eugraptos, as you can see in the slide, well written, is the monument of the stele. Or they mourn the deceased's untimely death. And you can see, for example, auromoros, untimely dead, and so on. Direct compounds. Just a couple of examples. Parodeporos is the equivalent of parodoiporos, the passerby, and replaces the more common hodoiporos in a verse inscription from Thomis dating from the 2nd century AD. Another example is eustichie, which is something like the beauty of the inscribed lines, and is used in the well-known tomb of the boy poet Quintus Sulpicius Maximus, 1st century AD from Rome, and indicates the beautiful lines of the poem composed by the dead boy Quintus Sulpicius Maximus on the occasion of the Capitolian Games, a poem which was carved on his own monument. Verbal compounds, so verb composition is one of the most productive morphologic strategies in the ancient Greek language, especially prepositional verb composition. In our corpus, most of verbal compounds are prepositional. You can see a few examples. In only one case, it is the uncompound verb, dresteo, the last example, that you can see. The uncompound verb is the apex. Hypodrestevo is attested in some Byzantine texts, but drestevo is attested only in one inscription from Mytilene and dating from the 1st century AD. Derivatives. Derivational morphology generates verbs, nouns, and adjectives from one basic form, and they are all prefix and suffix-based formations. For example, let us take aorosyne, which is the first example given in the slide. Aorosyne names the quality of those who die an untimely death, the aoroi. Yesterday, in Lucia Floridi's paper, we have seen the word leptosyne used by Nicarchus instead of leptotes. Here, aorosyne is used instead of aorotes, which is attested in other texts. And aorosyne might have been created in order to be used in a dactylic meter where aorotes couldn't fit in. And the suffix syne conveys an abstract meaning and is very productive. There are also gender suffixes. So, for example, as you can see, androletas is ares. Androleteira, the feminine form, is attested, and androletas comes from androleteira with a different suffix, gender suffix. And another example, very well known, is manuteira, an adjective used for the steel. The steel is manuteira, and it reveals who the dead person is and so on. So the masculine form menutes and menuter are attested. Manuteira is attested only in this inscription from Egypt, 1st century AD. Another interesting case is keneoma, from an inscription, from Smyrna, 3rd century BC. Keneoma tafu is the empty of a tomb. So this expression gives emphasis to the idea of empty rather than to that of tomb, and so on. Only a small minority are declension metaplasms. For example, aetheron instead of aether, or stagona instead of stagon, steringa instead of sterings. And these forms, of course, mirror some developments in the history of language, and they are interesting too. Borrowings are not always easy to detect. A few of them can be clearly recognized, and 4 out of 5 are mere transcriptions of the Latin names of military functions and names of gladiators. and military, hierarchy and hierarchy of the gladiators are genuine Roman creations, so there is no surprise that they retain Latin names even in Greek. But let us now have a look at our sample corpus, so to say, as a whole. Hapax legomena are puzzling, for we cannot state whether they were really used once and therefore created for this purpose, or whether they were used more often, although further attestations are lost. However, the probability that they are actually uncommon words and even single-use creations is higher than for poorly attested words, generally speaking. Be that as it may, whether or not they were created for the specific text which attests them, these hapaxes are mostly the results of compounding and suffixation, the two main strategies to create terms in ancient Greek. And the Greek language is especially versatile at creating new words. It is a sort of open source language, so to say. And cases of, as we have seen, cases of interference from other languages, cases of overlapping from other languages are very few and certainly less than one could expect. So influence of other languages is very low. In the light of all these, the sample corpus of funerary inscribed hapaxes collected appears to be a fairly typical Greek phenomenon. What these hapaxes can reveal about the much debated problem of the language of inscribed epigrams? Well, the vast majority of the small corpus examined are compounds, and although the Greek language allows extensive use of compounds in any field, word composition seems to be more a process of poetic and technical languages than of everyday language, and it implies a search for solemnity and a taste for a refined and precious diction that reveal the learned and artistic nature of this phenomenon. Furthermore, the vast majority of our inscribed funerary hapaxes are nouns, not verbs. And this too is remarkable, in my opinion, since nouns have a descriptive and a definitory function. Hapaxes appear to belong to a decorative, so to say, rather than to a pragmatic language. That is, they enrich and expand the language of poetry, which is more elaborate than that of ordinary speech. So hapaxes do not provide us with evidence concerning the everyday language. On the contrary, they seem to attest an artificial language. And yesterday we have learned from Lucia's paper that the authors of Scopic epigrams during the 1st and 2nd century AD use a language including Latinisms, neologisms, and make fun of the taste for creating new words in their poems. And Gregory reminded us that this taste is described by Plutarch in his Quaestiones Conviviales and suggested that it's part of a cultural context. Well, such a cultural context is common to all these texts, literary and inscribed, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of the grammarians attacked by Lucilius for example, in AP 11140 were composing verse inscriptions. Artists, epigrammatists such as Lucilius and Nikakos seem to work on some changes that we can partially observe in verse inscriptions. But let me add just one point. The inscriptions containing more than one hapax deserve a special attention, in my opinion, for in these cases a specific need or a specific intention on the part of the authors is apparent. In particular, just one example, in an epitaph of a stone cutter from Halicarnassus, 2nd, 3rd AD, there are 3 hapax compounds in the same text, and 2 of them are compounds beginning with litho, Lithodaidalos and Lithocalles. Another text from Egypt has, 2nd century BC, has 2 hapaxes, and both are compound adjectives, Baruchades and Himeropnus. So we have got some chains, so to say, of hapaxes employed in the same epigram, and they may reveal, in my opinion, not only a specific intention on the part of the author, but perhaps also a working style, possibly based on copybooks or pattern books circulating in the epigraphic workshops, and such pattern books may also help to explain the presence of the same word only in inscriptions, although in more than one inscription. The existence of copybooks used by stonecutters has been argued by many scholars on the basis of important evidence. It is the so-called copybook theory, and many people in this room have given an important contribution to this theory. As far as I can see, a survey of hapax legomena, although confined to the funerary genre, can raise some intriguing questions, at least concerning the structure and contents of such tools. For example, should we think of lexica or collections of epigram models? I'm rather convinced that we probably should admit both. Besides the collections of models, that the recurrence of lines and groups of lines in inscriptions coming from different places suggests. The poets working in the epigraphic workshops might have had at their disposal some lexicographic tools, perhaps specialized in funerary vocabulary. So, to conclude, hapax legomena are an ambiguous phenomenon, so to say. They spring from an artistic and learned tension, yet they often fail to attain high results and produce some unskilled and unnatural effects. After all, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, as we know. As a result, artistic and learned, let's say, ambition on the one side and awkward command of language cannot be separated in analyzing epigraphic hapaxes. And literary ambition and unsophisticated quality coexist in inscribed epigrams. In other words, we must be aware that Greek inscribed epigram cannot be contained in the box of literary poetry, nor in that of para-literature. It's always an all-inclusive means of expression. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, now we are expecting help with technology and imminent arrival of Alexander Sens per Skype, who is awaiting us at 4. So maybe while the Skype is being set up, we all know Alexander Sens' work. There is really no need for me to introduce him. I could possibly mention that his latest contribution to Epigram, latest grand contribution, was his recent commentary of Asclepiades, which he published with OUP in 2010. But now... Hello?
Hello, I think.
Hi, Alex. It's Ivana Petrovich speaking.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you really
can
well.
see you.
We are now waiting for a picture, which is still not emerging.
Let me see if I can.
Ah, there you are. Nice to see you. It works. Okay, so without further ado, I give you the Bema.
The disembodied head of Alex Sens. Thanks very much, and I'm very sorry not to be there with you, and I'm very grateful to everybody, to Vina in particular, for arranging this. So I hope this works.
It does.
Okay. In this paper, I want to consider the issue of closure in Hellenistic funerary epigram. By closure, I mean separate but closely interrelated issues. Most basically and literally, how individual funerary epigrams conclude, but also, since so many real and fictive epitaphs include, in one way or another, the voice of the deceased, the way that epitaphs treat the question of the continuity or finality of the speaker's voice. In the first category, I think of formal features like the arrangement of words and thematic elements, such as the expressions of lamentation that not infrequently appear at the end of individual epigrams. The second issue is obvious in poems in which the speaking voice, whether alone or as part of a dialogue, is represented as that of the deceased, but is perhaps particularly interesting in fictive epigrams honoring dead poets. I take it as a basic assumption that in claiming to honor a lost predecessor, many of these poems make an implicit claim to embody the voice of that poet, and thus to represent a continuation of his or her voice. As such, they not only assert their author's own literary affiliations, but also make a striking claim about the continuity of their honorand's voice even beyond death. The effect is particularly obvious in epigrams in which the speaking voice of the poem subsumes that of the honorand. Asclepiades 28, for instance, begins, "This is the sweet labor of Erinna." But even in a poem like Callimachus's tribute to Heraclitus, we can see the poet engaging in interesting ways with the extent to which the honorand's voice, and more importantly, his own conversation with it, transcend his demise. Sometimes, indeed, the idea that death marks an end is rejected entirely, as in an obviously Hellenistic poem from the Pseudo-Simonidean corpus, in which Anacreon is imagined to continue singing and cavorting in Hades. This is handout 1. The end of this epigram, not even in death did he put his lyre to rest in Hades, thus explicitly kicks back against the pathetic sepulchral commonplace that the dead person can no longer participate in activities in which he or she once took pleasure. Now, epigrams are, of course, highly variable in how they deal with closure in both of the senses in which I have used that term. And in the interest of time, what I have in mind is not anything like a synoptic treatment, even a synoptic treatment, but rather a highly selective glimpse at a small handful of examples, beginning with a very brief discussion of 2 epigrams by Anaite, a longer discussion of a tribute to Erinna ascribed to Leonidas or to Meleager, and a little coda on a famous Callimachus self-epitaph. Although the first 3 of these epigrams mark the deaths of young women, they handle the finality of death in very different ways. The first of these, number 2 on your handout, is an epigram by Anaite that purports to record the final words of a young woman called Erato to her father. "These words did Erato say to her dear father, having thrown her hands around him and shedding afresh tears. O father, I no longer exist for you, but blue-black death covers my eyes, as I am already dead." The first point to make about this poem, likely the earliest of several Hellenistic last words epigrams preserved in the Anthology and in the Milan Posidippus, is an obvious but important one, that its studied structure calls direct attention to the issue of closure. The epigram, which is in itself divided equally between narrative and reported speech, opens, perhaps paradoxically, with an adjective that means last, and that thus advertises the content of the entire poem. It closes, on the other hand, with the word for death, which brings to an end both the poem and the embedded voice of the dead girl. In this sense, then, the structure of the poem iconically marks its ending as coterminous with Erato's life. The pathetic finality of the girl's words is, moreover, underscored by the poem's use of earlier literature. On the one hand, the representation of the dying words of a young woman seems especially resonant of Attic tragedy, and indeed in several respects the language is distinctly tragic in coloring. But the more striking reuse of the literary tradition appears in the first line, where the phrase perichera balusa unmistakably evokes Odysseus' pointing words to the shade of his dead mother in the underworld at Odyssey 11:11, handout 3, where the hero expresses anguish at their inability to embrace one another. Anaite reverses the relationship. Whereas in the Odyssey, a son laments his inability to embrace his dead mother, here an unmarried girl embraces her father at the very moment of her death. The illusion, evoking as it does the unbridgeable divide between the living hero and his dead mother, underscores the pathos of the separation of parent and beloved child and the irrecoverability of the father's loss. Not only are Arato's words her last to her father, but this will be her last opportunity to embrace him in any meaningful way. At both structural and intertextual levels, then, the epigram carefully marks the finality of Arato's death. Now, my second poem, also by Anaite, treats closure rather differently. In this epigram, number 4, on the handout, the narrating voice reports that the mother of Thyrsis has erected a lifelike representation of her over her dead daughter's grave. Instead of a marriage chamber appointed with a nice bed and sacred marriage hymns, your mother set up above this marble tomb a maiden having your measure and your beauty, Thyrsis, and you were addressed even in death. At a formal level, the epigram resembles the numerous funerary epigrams that name the person responsible for erecting the tomb monument. See, for example, the passages in handout 5. But overlays on that basic structure the idea that the deceased has received burial instead of marriage. Obviously, the theme, death instead of marriage, is immensely common from an early period, but as we shall see, the poem handles it in a creative way. The point of the opening couplet is that Thyrsis' mother has not had the opportunity to perform basic marriage rites, like preparing the marriage chamber or singing wedding hymns. Instead, as the second and third lines make clear, she has set up an image of her daughter, an act whose point emerges in the final words of the poem. According to Pollux, the preliminaries to a Greek marriage included a ritual called the prosthenkteria, which seems to have involved wedding guests, and from its name, presumably included a formal address to the bride, probably by wedding guests. The point thus seems to be that although Thyrsis was unable to experience that rite in life, the existence of her image above her tomb meant that she was addressed as if she were alive despite being dead, and the phrase as a whole is thus tantamount to saying, you received the wedding address though dead. At a basic level, then, the poem plays on the idea that the marriage rite is inaccessible to a dead virgin by suggesting that at least one part of it was celebrated in Thyrsis' case. But the poem does something rather more interesting, too. The final line, after all, opens with an address to the dead girl by name, and so the last words of the poem may be understood to look back not only to an event in the past, but also self-referentially to what has just preceded in the poem itself. In a sense, then, the vocative Thyrsi performs the very ritual that the speaker describes. That is, to put it more directly, within the poem itself, Thyrsis is addressed directly by name. So understood, the poem's closural maneuver pushes against the distinction that defines so many epitaphs for women who have experienced mors immatura. Unlike Phrasiclea in the famous Attic epitaph and many others, Thyrsis will not always be called virgin, but in the epigram at least, will always be addressed as a bride would be, an act to be reenacted by every reader in perpetuity. A similar but rather more complex dynamic may be found in an epigram alternatively ascribed to Leonidas or to Meleager in the anthology. This is number 6 on your handout. The poem forms part of a series of epigrams honoring the poetess Erinna that traces back to the Asclepiadean poem I mentioned at the start. Knowing whether it's by Leonidas, to whom it is assigned by Gao Page, and thus the product of the early 3rd century, or by Meleager, and thus the product at the end of the late 2nd century, would be helpful for nailing down its literary affiliations, but is for our purposes not essential at all. The epigram opens as a narrative recounting the abduction of Erinna by Hades while the young virgin girl was picking flowers of a special sort. The virgin Erinna, a new singer among poets, Hades abducted for marriage as she was culling the flowers of the Muses. Indeed, the prudent girl said this rightly, "You are invidious, Hades." In having Hades abduct Erinna for marriage, the poem associates her with Persephone and unmistakably plays upon the account of the abduction of that goddess in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, thus evoking the commonplace theme of the deceased virgin's marriage to death. In this sense, the fact that the opening couplet of the poem defines Erinna in the accusative picks up the basic conventions of rhapsodic hymns, in which the first word of the poem is typically the name of the honorand in the accusative. But the generic and intertextual affiliations of the epigram are considerably more complex. We can leave to the side for the moment the question of whether the famous features of the way Erinna is depicted in Hellenistic epigrams is directly indebted to the way that poetess talked about herself and her poetic activity in the distaff, the only work we can attribute to her with confidence. Too much is uncertain about that poem, to be sure, and there is good reason, I think, to suppose that it does. In a basic sense, that issue is only marginally useful for evaluating how epigrammatists, creative artists in their own right, are representing that fact. It is an obvious point, but one worth making, that the epigram overlays the metaphor of a poet as a bee collecting pollen from flowers on the description of a young girl picking flowers. After all, the verb grepto, pick, is not a literal description of the bee's activity. Thus, the moment that Hades comes to snatch the maiden away to the underworld is represented as an interruption of her poetic activity. But what matters more for us is that both the imagery and the language of the passage are heavily freighted with literary significance. I here mention, but pass over quickly, the possible significance of the attribution to Meleager, who in the opening lines of the prefatory poem attached to the Garland describes his own project in terms that look striking like Erinna's activity, as a collection of flowers representing the work of his predecessors that he has woven together. Given the impossibility of determining the authorship of our epigram, and thus whether it represents a mise en abîme of Meleager's collection, I want to focus instead on the fact that, as Camillo Neri has well observed, the description of Erinna as plucking the flowers of the muses, muson anthea dreptomenon, is deliberately and intensely Pindaric. Indeed, Neri has suggested that the nominal phrase muson anthea has a specific antecedent in Olympian 9, 47-9, which I give as handout 7, where the speaking voice enjoins, "Awaken for them a clear song path, praise old wine, but the flowers of younger hymns." The connection depends not just on the use of anthea plus a defining genitive to denote poetry, but also, as we shall see, on the interest in novelty in each passage. Before we think more closely about this connection, however, we must note that the verb drepo, from which the participle dreptomenon derives, is extremely common one in Pindar. Indeed, its use in that poet is significant, for in the Pindaric corpus, the word is consistently used to denote people reaping the fruit of their own arete and success, including the fruits of songs in their honor. I give a pair of passages in handout 8. Thus, at the level of language, Erinna's poetic composition is represented in terms that in Pindar are used of victors and other honorands, who call the rewards of song and other goods. Put differently, the description of Erinna affiliates her with a Pindaric victor, and in this sense, the language of Eponician praise is appropriately redeployed in the epigram to honor its subject. At an obvious literal level, Erinna's reaping of the flowers of the muses denotes her composition of poetry, an act that is represented as ongoing at the moment of her death. At the implicit, intertextual level, however, it also suggests that she is the beneficiary of honorific song, and the speaker of the epigram thus sets up an implicit analogy between his own composition and Pindaric eponition, though of course he has made generically appropriate changes in order to condense the sprawl of choral lyric to an orderly miniaturized generic context. The affiliation of Erinna with a Pindaric victor, I think, helps explain the conclusion of the poem, where the speaker turns to accuse Hades of Boscania, invidia. After all, one of the basic dynamics of Eponician poetry is that the labor and ultimate success of the honorand place him in danger of being the object of divine and human envy. In the epigram, that is exactly what happens to Erinna immediately after she has been treated in Epidician language. But in this epigram, the dynamic is considerably more complicated than that. In Pindar, the relationship between the victor and the poet is reciprocal, and the threat of danger to one is also a threat of invidia to one is also a threat to the other. Invidia of the victor jeopardizes the poet, and so does invidia directed at the poet pose a danger to the victor. In our epigram, of course, Erinna is both the honorand and a poet, and in the opening couplet, she is treated in a way that closely links her to Pindar herself. I've already mentioned Olympian 9, 47-9, where the speaker notes that the flowers of the newest hymns are best. As Neri observed in his study of the testimony to Erinna, in the context of that allusion, the characterization of Erinna as a neo-oidos is not just a reference to her youth, but an acknowledgement of the quality of her poetry, of its novelty. But since in Olympian 9 the new hymns in question are Pindar's own, the epithet also associates Arina with the Pindaric voice. Like him, she is the producer of novel poetry, and thus the poem implies poetry of the highest quality. The association is furthered by the representation of Arina as a bee, for though the insect was widely linked to poetry and with a number of poets, it had a particularly strong connection with Pindar, about whom it is said that he had his mouth smeared with wax by bees, and who himself directly associates his style with the flight of bees. But whereas Pindar merely raises the specter of jealousy, Arina is implicitly its victim. In the final couplet, the speaker notes the veracity of her words, "You are invidious, Hades." The same phrase is found in an epigram ascribed, probably spuriously, to Arina herself, where it is used to describe the passerby's reaction to the death of Baucis. It remains uncertain whether the phrase was used by Arina in distaff, and thus whether our epigram was looking to and quoting the pseudo-Arinan epigram or the distaff itself. But whatever the case, our epigram applies to Arina herself language elsewhere used of her honorand Baucis, and thus creates an affiliation between them. At the obvious level, Hades is represented as the god of the underworld who feels jealousy about and thus interrupts Arina's poetic production, just as a late Hellenistic epigram from Egypt, given in handout 9, represents death itself as personified Baskaniye. At the same time, at a meta-literary level, Hades in the epigram stands also as the invidious and poorly informed audience whose jealousy Pindar represents as a constant danger. In this sense, the allusions to Pindaric poetry in the first couplet and the emergence of Hades' invidia in the second form a coherent unit. In the context of a Hellenistic poem about a poet, though, the danger posed by envy directed at the honorand takes on a special significance. As we all know, in the prologue to the Aetia, Callimachus defends his work against the carping of his critics, whose motives he connects to jealousy, urging the destructive race of envy, Baskanies aloangenos, to be gone. The language of the passage finds a complement in a mock epitaph for his father, where Callimachus refers to himself as a poet who sang greater than invidia. We shall return to that briefly. Similarly, at the conclusion of his hymn to Apollo, the god of poetry aggressively defends Callimachus against envy, Phthonos, who is trying to conduct a smear campaign. Read in the light of such passages, Hades' Baskania, whatever else it may be, is revealed to be as that of the mean-spirited, chiding critic who fails to understand good poetry. In Callimachus' Aetia, the poet's critics are sent off as a destructive race, which is to say as readers who know only how to destroy others rather than to produce anything of merit on their own. And so it is in the Arina epigram with Hades. Now, I'll acknowledge that there's no way to prove that the author of the epigram had Callimachus explicitly in mind, and if the poem is by Leonidas, it's quite possible that it preceded the Aetia prologue. But at the risk of some circularity, it seems to be an unlikely coincidence that in an epigram on a poet who was later, in a famous critique by Antiphanes, quite explicitly connected to Callimachian aesthetic values, should make Arina the victim of Baskania, and it thus seems fair to suggest that Hades, god of destruction, is implicitly treated as an invidious critic who lacks the ability to produce good poetry and can only tear down the poems of others. In a justly famous article from 1972, Elroy Bundy has demonstrated that Callimachus' account of Apollo's harsh treatment of envy is a variation of a closural break-off formula in which the poet concludes his work by self-referentially expressing his wishes for its positive reception. The basic concept is reflected both in rhapsodic prayers that the divine honorand of a hymn rejoice at the poet's song, and in other forms of praise poetry, in the wish that the jealousy of others will do no damage either to the honorand or to the poet whose song is the vehicle for the honorand's kleos. Seen against this backdrop, the fate of Arina's poetry, interrupted by Hades' intervention, seems at first highly unlucky. An invidious god has intervened to cut off the poet's work. But is this really the case? I've already suggested that epigrams on dead poets make an implicit claim to continuity by suggesting that they themselves embody the honorand and thus preserve his or her poetic values. It is thus a simple but important point that in quoting the words of Arina, wherever they in fact derive from, our poem both asserts and participates in the posthumous survival of her verse. Given that death is, after all, the ultimate moment of closure, the poet's adaptation of Pindaric language forms part of a broader meditation on the power of poetry to survive not only the envy of its detractors, but also the inevitable death of its author. Against this backdrop, I'd like to conclude by returning to Callimachus's fictional self-epitaph. But first, I need to digress very briefly to consider the relationship of death, poetic activity, and jealousy in a Latin poem. The final elegy of the first book of the Amores by Ovid. That poem begins with an address to Livor, Envy, who has accused the poet of laziness over the years. This is handout 11. Why, biting Envy, do you fault me for my lazy years and call my poem the work of inactive talent? To this criticism, the poet responds that he wants not the transitory recognition of military, legal, or forensic activity, but the enduring worldwide fame provided by poetry. He then launches into a chronologically sweeping poetic history in which he records and enacts the posthumous survival of his predecessors, both Greek and Roman. The poem, and with it the book, conclude by returning to the issue of invidia. Livor, Ovid says, exists only among the living and becomes irrelevant after death. Even when he has been burnt on the pyre, the poet concludes he will live on, at least in part. The play with issues of closure is at one level obvious. Ovid concludes the final book of his poem with a reference to death, but simultaneously imagines his poetry, which at the literal level is now finished in the sense that the reader has completed his reading of the book, transcending the boundaries of both his life and of his book. Clearly, the critique imputed to Livor in the opening lines of the elegy recalls Telchinus's notorious carping in the prologue to the Aetia. But Ovid reframes the critique about poetic style into a critique of the very act of literary composition, which his imagined critics associate with laziness and inactivity. At an obvious level, Ovid thus picks up on the depiction of poetry as the product of otium that one finds in Catullus and Virgil, but he also may be implicitly recognizing and playing on the traditional association of envy with labor, rather than with inactivity. Beyond that, it's worth pointing out that the poet pointedly rejects the association of envy and death, an idea we see not only in the Arena epigram, but even in the Callimachine description of the Telchinus as the oloon genos baskanies in the Aetia. Now, similar points could be made about the ends of several other Latin poems, including Virgil's Georgics and most notably Statius Thebaid, which also close by evoking, directly or indirectly, the threat that envy poses to the posthumous survival of the poet's work. Such passages reflect the closural strategy by which a poet brings his composition to a conclusion by canvassing the possibility of a hostile, invidious reception. This fact, in turn, is useful for thinking about the structure of Callimachus's self-epitaph. At the risk of stating the obvious, I'm clearly not assuming a rupture in the space-time continuum in which Callimachus is somehow looking to a poet living 250 years or so later, but rather suggesting that both are tapping into a closural strategy with shared roots in the tradition. In Callimachus's self-epitaph, the poet's claim to have sung greater than invidia plays on the same closural strategy found in the Amores by imagining the poet in his own epitaph speaking from the grave and asserting his ultimate triumph over that invidia, which is another way of asserting the continued success of his poetry after death. Put differently, the epitaphic form allows the speaking voice to look retrospectively rather than, as in Ovid and other poets, prospectively at the reception of the work. Such a view of the poem is not materially affected by the problematic authenticity of the third couplet that is transmitted in the Palatine Anthology, but has seemed to many suspicious for its overlap with the Aetia prologue and with the problematic connection with for its problematic connection with what precedes. Except that I should say that if the poet's claim to have triumphed over envy constitutes the very final words of his epigram, its closural strategy will be all the more pointed. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. So now what we had in mind was to have a joint discussion of your paper and Valentina's paper, which preceded you. And I was told, because there are microphones in the audience, that you would be able to hear a question, but if not, I will repeat it if the question is for you. Okay?
Okay, sounds good.
So questions? I can't obviously answer anything about Andrea's paper, but we have two candidates to question now. Peter?
Yeah, I have a question for Valentina. One of the things that struck me, Valentina, in those compound hapaxes that you presented to us, was that basically in most of them, the meaning is very straightforward. One doesn't have to puzzle over the meaning of any of them. So I wondered whether your description of these as learned and artful is quite on target. I mean, artful, yes, in a way, in the sense perhaps of ornate, but they didn't strike me as words that, for example, you would find in glosses, things that need explanation in some way or another. But and I was wondering if you saw that similarly or would disagree.
Yes, thank you, Peter, for your point. Um, yes, in most cases, these compounds are, understandable. I have given just a couple of examples of compounds where the relation, the connection between the two parts of the compound is not, is not clear, but the meaning, the basic meaning of these compounds is obvious. The choice of these unusual, so to say, compounds and of the derivatives also seems to me a choice which betrays a sort of ambition to construct, to build up a language which is different from everyday language, So when I said learned, I meant basically this, a sort of search for a language which is anyway different from everyday language because of this. I'm not sure I have answered your question. Please tell me if this was your point.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure that I would describe that as learned. I mean, in the sense that, for example, some Homeric hapaxes or even dislegomena are things that for centuries then people debated what on earth does this mean. And, that then Hellenistic poets would embed in passages that effectively comment then on the meaning or their particular interpretation of the meaning. In this case, it struck me as an artful and sort of ornate language, but that's designed to be, for the most part, immediately comprehensible.
Yes. And I think you are right from this point of view. Absolutely, yes. Thank you for your suggestion and observation. Yes.
Ewan?
Thank you very much, Valentina, for excellent and very stimulating paper. And my question is a follow-up to what Peter was saying. And I suppose it's particularly in the area of compounds. I feel it's very difficult to know whether something that for us first comes in an epigram inscribed on stone was for that poet an innovation or was just something that was in the vocabulary of his region or her region or even a more widespread vocabulary. In Hellenistic and imperial prose, we find an increasing number of compound and double compound verbs that had not been attested before, and when we find them in a text like Diodorus, we tend, I think, to say not that Diodorus is trying to be very creative, but that this is one of the words that's going around we just don't happen to have attested in those texts that have survived to us. And I wonder how it is, what sort of methodology one can apply to fake griechische Schriften to distinguish between hapaxes, which are meant to be hapaxes, and hapaxes which just happen not to be attested.
Yes, of course, we cannot answer, we cannot be sure about this. We cannot know whether these words were actually created on purpose, created for that specific text or not. So we can just describe what is attested and what it attested only in verse inscriptions. I have cut much of my paper for reasons of time, but I have taken into consideration also some words which are attested for example, in one verse inscription and in an ancient lexicon. And these cases are quite interesting, in my opinion, because, a word attested in an ancient lexicon may go back to a literary text, but it may not. So, and I have also included a few words which are attested only in verse inscriptions, but in more than one verse inscription. And these cases are very interesting too, because these words are not attested only once, but they are attested, as I said, only in verse inscriptions. So there are, of course, different categories within this small corpus, and from a methodological point of view, they must be treated in different ways with paying a specific attention to the different status of each of these categories. Yes, and thank you also for your suggestion about a comparison with, for example, compounds or even neologisms used in prose texts. As I said, the discussion, yesterday's discussion, and some texts which have been presented yesterday struck me because I think we deal with a cultural context where, of course, also creating words or just create derivatives is something perhaps less unusual than we can think, and all these phenomena of the context, of specific chronological context, must be kept together in order to approach the inscribed funerary hapaxes in a correct manner. So thank you very much.
Andre, you have a question, and then Ben.
Thank you very much, Valentina. I think this was a splendid piece of scholarship, extremely impressive. Just the sheer amount of work that you had to invest is breathtaking. Actually, I had two questions. I was looking at personal names in archaic and classical verse inscriptions, and what I noticed is that a number of names come up in unusual forms, which means that instead of being attested in their normal form, they would be either shortened or syncopated and so on. And when I looked through the LGPN, I couldn't find many parallels. In some cases, we could say these are the only occurrences of the name. And these things could be treated as sort of hapax-eremena as well. And the only explanation that I could come up with is that in some cases, at least, the names were treated in such a way or formulated in such a way was to fit the meter. And I was wondering whether in some of your examples, meter plays a role. And my second question would be, what would be roughly the percentage of those hapax-eremena or legomena where we are really struggling to find the meaning, like in your case of the Phoenician inscription, Echthrileon, or I can't remember the exact form. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Andri. As for the unusual form of names, which is basically which must be used in order to fit the meter. I have mentioned, if you remember perhaps the case of the example of aorosyne instead of aorotes. But as far as I could see, there are just a few cases. I mean, I don't have the impression that this element affects this phenomenon in a heavy way. And sorry, your second question was.
How many cases of hapax-legomena do we have where we are struggling to understand the meaning?
Okay, yes. Yes. As I said, I have collected 131 hapaxes, and I would say that the number of words where we struggle with meaning is something like 15, at least. And sometimes it's really hard to find parallels. You know, when you have, when we deal with compounds, it's easier because we can compare these compounds with other compounds which have perhaps the same one part which is the same of the compound, and also with the derivatives, the suffix or the prefix helps us. But sometimes it's even hard to you know, to find the root which is used, and sometimes we have the doubt that there is another language behind. In the case of the mysterious compound ecthroleon that you have mentioned, is perhaps one of the most intriguing cases. There, we guess, just a guess, that there is some Phoenician, perhaps, or Semitic word behind a name or a compound. But it's very frustrating sometimes to realize that we have to give up. And okay, the Skype left us. What else?
Yes,
okay, Alex is calling. Yeah.
Ben, is that a question for Alex?
Thank you, Andri. Thank you very much.
A comment for Valentina and then a question for an addition for Alex. Valentina, I was also wondering about some of the compounds, whether because they are compounds, and here Lanufes is a good one, we don't read more into them than they might originally have sort of affected. So this looks like a really clever compound that refers to poetry on stone and to the act of poetry as weaving, and then weaving on stone. But that might also be the reader, I mean, the modern, or rather my impression, because I've never seen the word before, and it looks really outstanding, but we can't really test. I mean, I suppose there's just a question of how can you sort of test the power of a compound when the comparanda are none.
it's very hard to test the power of these compounds. I think one must, as I said, always compare with compounds with a line, in this case, for example, as the first part of the compound, and so this comparison, I think, gives us some clues for going on and trying to, to perceive the real effect of these compounds, or other words. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Alex, I just wanted to add a note. You could include on death and invidia, you could include the Heraclitus epigram, because there it is Hades who snatches everything away, but the poem specifically are going to live on of Heraclitus. So you have sort of another example of this concept of the poetry surviving death, or surviving invidia.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Yes, yeah, I agree. I think the interesting thing in all of those cases is the way that the actual structure of the epigram, the way that the epigrams conclude with the final point, that sort of at the very moment when the poem is concluding, we have this intimation that the voice will continue after the poem is over and after the speaker's death, or after the deceased end.
Gregory?
Thank you very much, Alex, for an extremely wide-ranging paper, which included in its range discussion of Ovid's development of some of these ideas. I wondered if I could just mention another possible development which might be of interest, just to see what you think. With your item 2, I think this may be taken up in Virgil's account of the death of Camilla in Book 11 of the Aeneid. Camilla doesn't weep like Erato. She says, "Hark tenus aca soror potui, nunc omnia circum nigrescunt oculis." And all that is not just the end, that's the men clause. She goes on to say, so go and tell Turnus to keep the enemies away from the city. So she's not just ending there, she's got a practical job to do, she's part of a sort of military chain. So that offers a Latin poet envisaging a different way of somebody thinking about their own death. They're just part of something larger and practical. Thank you.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm not sure what to say, not having the text right in front of me, but thank you very much.
Nita?
I have a question for Alex too, and it's about the sort of the contrast between drepo and harpazo, where you have two verbs that essentially mean to grab something and take it for yourself. One of which has clearly been marked as hostile and fatal, and the other has been sort of associated with activities of cultivation and fertility and the production of poetry. And do you have any? What do you see as the relationship between these two? It is, after all, the typical fate of young women plucking flowers to be themselves plucked.
Right. And I think as I was trying to suggest, I think that the notion of drepo in this poem entails a sort of Pindaric idea of receiving a reward for one's activity. And so in that sense, I think the opposition is very pointed, right? I mean, it's built into the tradition, but it's also a pointed opposition that contributes, I think, to the ultimate point, which is that despite the hostility of the divine reception of this poet, and which is, after all, what Pindar is which the sort of closural break-off formula is concerned about. Her activity will continue in some form, despite the interruption of Hades' snatching.
Any other questions? Meanwhile, I could, perhaps you'll be interested, there is a great parallel for this envy as a beginning of reception in the domain of building art. So SGO 281 is a fantastic epigram that's sort of the reverse dedicatory. It addresses the person who is watching the building, the dedication, and says, if you are learned enough to appreciate what you're seeing, then enjoy. If not, all that you can do is to melt in envy whilst looking at this building. And this is sort of this ending with envy.
That's wonderful. You said 281?
Yes, SGO 281 from
Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Any other questions? Yes, Marco?
Hi, Alex.
Hi, Marco.
Hi. It seems to me that in the epigram for Rinna by Leonidas or Meliager, there is in a way the combination of two metaphors. The tragic metaphor of the marriage to Hades, which substantiates the first two lines, two lines, and the point, which develops this metaphor into the Bourdieu kind of envy as the metaphor for the opponents, for the enemies that interrupts the activity of a poet. And it seems that the epigram starts as a reproposition of the metaphor of the marriage to Hades as a metaphor for the death of a young girl, and continues by developing the Callimachian and post-Callimachian frequent image of envy as a kind of interruption or a tentative interruption of the poetic activity. Do you agree that maybe the epigram is constructed in this way?
Yes, perfectly. I had hoped that I would sort of articulate that, but if it wasn't clear, I think that's exactly what's going on.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks.
If there are no further questions, and this was the last session of the day, I can thank you very much, Alex, for making this possible, and the organizers, and thank you, Valentina. And I would just like to remind you that there is dinner tonight at 9, and tomorrow we start at 9:30 instead of 10. So get your beauty sleep perhaps in the afternoon. And I shall see you tonight. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, everybody.